We are jumping back into the 1973 Dodge Charger. On the last episode, we got the entire car tidied up and we're all back together. Now we're going to start it for the very first time and we're going to start the break-in process. A couple things that you want to know is that you want to set your ignition timing and everything before you start the car, or at least get it very, very close. In the last episode, you guys saw that I took everything apart, but before I did, I noted that everything was working properly the way it was supposed to before I took it apart. Something I didn't show you guys is that I actually marked everything before taking it apart. So I ended up putting it back exactly the way it was. The only thing that we need now is we need to get some fuel to the carburetor, and then we're going to turn the idle up a little bit and see if we can get this started. Once we get this thing started, we're gonna have to rev this thing up to 2,500 RPMs and then leave it there for about 25 minutes. So that's enough talking. Let's go ahead and break in this engine. Just like I mentioned before, I'm going to be using a remote starter in order to get this going. That way I have complete control of the carburetor and make sure it doesn't die. You want this thing to start up and run as quickly as possible in order to avoid as much damage to the cam. You're going to want to be spraying that camshaft with oil in order to increase your chances of success when running a flat tappet cam. So let's go ahead and get this thing started. First, I'm going to set up the idle at about 1500. I've already primed a little bit of fuel inside the carburetor, so it should at least start up fairly well. By the sound of that, I think our break-in procedure was successful. I'm going to let it cool down completely before starting it back up and checking some more things out on it to make sure 100% that none of the lobes are wiped and none of the lifters has collapsed. So while we're doing that, let me go ahead and show you guys the oil that I used in order to get this thing broken in. So my weapon of choice for break-in oil has always been the AMSOIL. I was never a huge proponent of using high-end oils, but every single time I've ever done a flat tappet cam, like on our 318 Duster and the Challenger 440, we've always used the AMSOIL break-in oil. I've never actually used regular oil with the zinc additive. I've always used just straight break-in oil, dump it in there and pray and hope that everything holds together. I've ran the same oil on 3 different camshafts on these Mopars with 3 different displacements, obviously, and so far I've had no problems. So while I wait for this engine to fully cool down, I'm gonna go ahead and jump on something else. The radiator that we are looking at right now is a modular radiator made by PRW. It is the Ford/Mopar universal style radiator. Although it is a single pass radiator, it has some really cool features, but the most impressive feature are these plugs that are on each corner of the radiator, and what this allows you to do is it allows you to move the inlet and outlet location to either side. So for example, on big block Mopars, they make 2 different water pump housings where you can have the outlet on either the driver or the passenger side. So depending on what water pump housing you have, you can either have it on the bottom right or the bottom left side of the radiator. The drawback of this is that if your water pump housing has an outlet on, say, the passenger side, then that means means the water inlet has to be on the opposite corner. So if it was on the driver's side, the inlet would have to be on the passenger side, and if it was on the passenger side, the water inlet would have to be on the driver's side. I used to run a truck style radiator, like a 70s Dodge truck radiator, and that was all fine and dandy. The inlet and outlets were the same size as the big block Mopar that's in here. The only issue was that the truck radiator, or at least the aftermarket versions of the truck radiator, were just significantly taller than what needed to be running this car. So in order to alleviate that, I went ahead and I got this radiator, which is significantly shorter, but the actual dimensions of the core is the same, so I'm not going to lose any kind of cooling capacity, even though the radiator is significantly shorter. Alright, so let's take a look at our hose location. So we've got this water outlet here on top, and it comes out to the driver's side. With the radiator centered, we pretty much have the upper hose where it needs to be. If anything, I could scoot this radiator over about 1.5 inches, 2 inches further to the passenger side, and then this hose would line up perfectly and I would have no problems. If we look at the bottom hose, however, we run into two issues. The first issue is that the hose is definitely not long enough to reach, and the second issue is that the water outlet for the radiator contacts this control arm for the independent front suspension on the Dodge Charger. So we're going to need to do two things. The first thing is we're going to have to raise this radiator up high enough that we can get out of the way of that control arm. We're going to raise it about this high. The second thing is that we're going to have to modify this radiator hose in order to have it extend far enough that it reaches this water outlet. I've taken some measurements, and above the core support I had about 1.5 inches of clearance before we contact the hood. So now if we take a look at this with the radiator cap, I'm at about 1/2 inch above the core support. So that means I have another inch that I can raise the radiator up in order to clear that subframe. The next issue that we run into is that if the radiator outlet on this side is too high up, I won't be able to run the hose back up into the radiator, because as of right now, the radiator hose is significantly lower than the one on the radiator. Even if I trim the hose, I don't think I'm going to have the clearance necessary to run this radiator hose up. So after looking at this for a while, I've come to the conclusion that I'm going to have to switch these sides. So that bottom inlet, I'm going to have to change to the driver's side. The top inlet, I'm going to have to change to the passenger side. And to accomplish this, we're going to be swapping out the water pump housing. So what I've got here is a water pump housing made out of aluminum. I'm not sure who manufactured this one specifically. We picked it up at a swap meet several years ago, so it's been trapped in a box in storage for a really long time. So I went ahead and I pulled it out to just see what I can work with, and the difference is that since the water pump housing that I have here is like the truck style or an older style version of this water pump housing, it has a drop on the passenger side, and so switching over to the quote-unquote car style of water pump housing, this is going to move it to the driver's side, which will allow me to replace the radiator hose that's currently on the passenger side and now move it to the driver's side. So before we get any further with the radiator install, I'm gonna have to take apart the front end again, and we're gonna go ahead and swap out the water pump housing to this nice aluminum one. I did end up fabricating some mounts to get this radiator to fit, but because this radiator can be installed through the back or the sides, it actually made installation fairly easy. It only took about an hour or two to fit the radiator where it needed to be, and the hoses took a little bit longer, but that's all taken care of. So now that I have the engine cooled off and the cooling system's ready to go, let's go ahead and take this for a drive. The engine doesn't sound too radical, but that's fine. The cam wasn't too crazy either. So I'm pretty happy with the way it sounds. It definitely does not sound stock anymore at the very least. But overall, the power band feels really good, especially during wide open throttle pulls. The engine feels like it goes all the way to redline pretty easily. Whereas before it used to come up real slow. So it definitely picked up some power with that cam. I just don't know exactly how much. We're gonna have to schedule out a dyno day in the near future. But overall, I'm pretty happy with the car. There's a couple more things I want to work on before we head back out to the dyno, and those videos will come out quickly compared to this one. But I'm going to end this one here. I'll see you guys all in the next one. Night Wrencher out.